Welcome to our very first thematic forum for the day, a human-centered approach to resilient infrastructure. Building and maintaining resilient infrastructure requires the purposive and meaningful engagement of people, the users, the beneficiaries in the design, planning, and maintenance of such systems. This session will put the spotlight on the participation of people, putting people at the center of the conversation on resilient infrastructure. We'll be hearing about community-based approaches to disaster-resilient infrastructure. We'll be seeing stories from the field, and we'll have a very exciting workshop on human and equity-centered design, a new lens on reimagining infrastructure. I will now introduce our moderator for the day, Ms. Zonibel Woods. Ms. Woods is a senior social development specialist from ADB. She specializes in gender and development. Ms. Woods has dedicated over 30 years to address barriers to gender equality and create opportunities for women and girls to live healthy, productive lives free from discrimination and violence. She has extensive and diverse expertise in gender and development and sustainable development, including capacity building. Over to you, Ms. Woods.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session. We're very excited to have a really interesting panel and presentations today. But before we start, I would like to invite us to watch a very brief video called Water Warrior of Alcigar. And this will be followed by a short presentation from the organization that produced this video, they will explain sort of a little bit of the background of the video. So if we can start the video, please.
मेरा नाम बुरकी भाई, गांव अलसीगढ़, पंचायत अलसीगढ़। मेरे गांव में कुछ पानी की समस्या है। तो बारिश बढ़ती थी तो नाला पानी नीचे जाता तो रुकता ही नहीं। हापड़ा और पानी नहीं मिलता, एक मटको लाता सुबह जाए तो हाजे तक पानी बोझ चलता हो न कड़ा घर में जाता तो को लोटो पर पानी नहीं देता पहले तो कम पानी ले जाते 5 किलोमीटर से पानी गर्मी में लावे जाती में थी तालाब बड़े एक कुओं पुरानी को 2 कुआं पानी मिलता तो कणा दड़ कुआ मिलता कणा दड़ कुआ मिलता बहुत समस्या पानी रही बहुत समस्या भारी वेती पसे कौआ ऊंडा खाल देती पसे पासो हेडपम्प कटे सरकारी व्यवस्था के कटे हेडपम्प लग रहा हेडपम्प पानी भरता साल पर हेडपम्प खराब हो जाता तो पानी पीलो आता वो पानी पीता ये वो पानी पीवा मिल रही है खेती में कैसे कहीं करेंगे कैसे पिया कैसे खेती कमावा कैसे तो वो मजूरी में जाना अकेलो आटो वो कना खेती में बेतो कना सोमासा बेती फिर मैं ऐसे ग्रुप जोड़ा मेला कैसा समझाने जोड़िया मेला को घर में बाहर निकलती नहीं थी घरवाला मीटिंग में आती औरतें थे घरवाला आदमी लड़ाई करता तो बहुत मुश्किल से एक मेला बुलाए पसे ग्रुप जोड़ा मैंने मीटिंग जोड़े समझाया कैसे क्या करेंगे आप तो बार मैं मीटिंग रखी ऐसे जी मीटिंग जोड़ के फिर एक मेला के समझाया फिर पानी आप कैसे क्या करा आप कुछ पानी बसाना बात करा आप तो मीटिंग बार मीटिंग करते रही पानी बसाना वास्ते की दिमाग फिर वो मैं कुछ जोड़ा समंदर से जुड़ा मैं समझी फिर मैं गांव में फील्ड में मैं औरतों ने समझाया फिर इन्निकट का काम शुरू करवाया इन्निकट बनवाया फिर पानी रुका और आसपास में कौआ वो भी पक्का करवाया फिर उसको इन्निकट का पानी से सारू हुआ कौआ पानी भी ले रही हो अब घर तक पानी आ रही है अब सब्जी भी कमा रही है फूल भी कमा रही ने बहुत अच्छा से कमा रही पहले पैसे नहीं मिलता था अबे फूल है तोड़ने लेने जा तो थोड़ा खर्चा पानी बच्चा के लिए व्यवस्था कर रही हूँ पंचायत में मेला को बार में पंचायत बेती तो पहले मैं बुलाता ही नहीं था पंचायत में लेडीज़ नहीं बेती पुरुष भी बेता पहले को मंजूर बेटा ने लेडीज़ नहीं बेटा था मैं बुला के पंचायत में ग्राम सभा में बुलाऊँ और छोटी मोटी मीटिंग में बुलाऊँ पहले मैं मेरे ऐसे जा मीटिंग बेटावे बेटा हिकावे फिर मैं दूसरी बात करूँ ऐसे मत समझा दे मैं क्या वहाँ जाना तो अपने काम मांगा अपना कई दुख है अपने घर का क्या दुख है अपना शरीर का क्या दुख है खेती का क्या दुख है आप मांगेगा पंचायत हो तो आप मिलेगा नहीं बोलेगा तो नहीं मिलेगा वार्ड 500 में मैं काम मांगूंगा पंचायत से आगे वो कड़ा रखे रोड नहीं है रोड पास कराऊंगा मैं, किसके पानी नहीं है तो पंगट भी दिवाऊंगा अभी, हैंडपम्प पहले भी करवाया और अभी भी पानी व्यवस्था और कराऊंगा, फिर बंदा बनाऊंगा और खेती के बंदा बनाऊंगा मैं। और फिर कोई मजदूरी है, मेला की मजदूरी बार बार कटे जा मजदूरी जाएगी नहीं, तो मेला के पास है बच्चा बच्ची ध्यान रखे तो मेला के घर बैठे कोई मजदूरी व्यवस्था कराऊँ गाँव में लोकर वास्ते।
Great, thank you. This is so wonderful to start with a voice from the field who can really explain the significance of really having people-centered infrastructure, and to tell us a little bit more about the background behind the video and about the work of their organization. I'd like to introduce Ms. Rimji Pandey, who's the head of Community Institutions Program of the nonprofit organization Seva Mandir. Rimjin has been working in the development sector for the last 14 years, particularly in tribal communities, and on planning and implementation of projects that support rural livelihoods. So I'll hand it over to you, Rimjin.
Thank you. So Seva Mandir works in semi-arid region where droughts are frequent and people face a lot of water scarce situations every now and then. So our work experience of last many decades have taught us that unless we build a human infrastructure in the village at a local level, it will be impossible to deal with the physical infrastructure being created in the villages. So we are trying to create a model that creates a joint vision for development of any kind of infrastructure in a village, and for that joint vision we need to develop collective leadership in a village at rural level, where we can create multiple leaders among men and women, and they are able to take ownership and lead simultaneously together without any discrimination of caste, gender or socio-economic backgrounds. They can lead together for development of their village, and not only lead, they can demand, raise voices and put a peer pressure on the local governing bodies, the gram panchayats, to build the right infrastructure at the right place for right people. They come in the meeting without any discrimination and talk about the development of whole village, keeping in mind the benefit for poorest of the poorest households that need to be taken care of. So when they come together, they are able to lead through multiple stakeholder ownership, where they themselves are responsible for taking care and sustaining the infrastructure that is built in the village. So if they want to make a kind of check dam, or they want to do soil and water conservation activities in their village, they are themselves responsible, and they take ownership that if in future those activities need any kind of repair and maintenance, they come together and do voluntary labor for getting those rejuvenated, getting those keeping those in a fresh condition, so that everybody is benefited, and everybody is benefited without any kind of giving a bias to a particular person or another. And another factor that is important in developing human infrastructure is giving equal ownership to men and women simultaneously. So we have made it mandatory that there should be women in the village development committee, and there should be an equal representation of women there, so that these women can lead. They are in the villages, they are dealing with the day-to-day problems of water crisis or any other things, and they are the ones who are more sensitive and have a different approach of looking after their infrastructure, because they are the ones who have to deal with all these problems. If they have to walk 2 kilometers to fetch water from a well, and if the water level goes down, it's the women who will suffer the most. So keeping women in center of all these activities should be the core of all the development. Third and last thing I would like to add is involving future leaders, the current youth generation and the adolescents who will be taking care of these infrastructures in future, because the times are bad, and I don't hope that it will be a great situation ahead. So involving these younger generations in these dialogues is equally important. However, still because of their lack of interest, they are missing in these current dialogues, and we are aiming to get them together at the platform. And with this, we have been able to create an impact where people are actually trying to support the local governing bodies and also oppose if the local governing bodies are not taking right decisions for the infrastructure development. They have, these village communities have seen a lot of drought years where they have taken care of their infrastructure well, and they have been successful in becoming resilient to all kind of crisis situations. They are very better off in comparison to the nearby villages. So there have been a lot of studies which say that these committees which involve equal participation of men and women are more able to create multiple leaders, and the assets that are being built in the villages are more sustainable for a very longer period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation and that overview of the really important work that you're doing at the community level. So I will now move on to our panelists. We will begin with two of our panelists and we'll move on to the other two. And this is, as you can see, this is a hybrid virtual session. So there might be a little bit of delay, I think, in when some of the speakers are coming on, but we're making it work. So it's really great that we have, that we are resilient in that sense and that we have adapted to this also new way of working. So thank you to the organizers for making it possible for us to participate despite the distance and still some of the restrictions that we have around traveling. So I will move on to Divya Reddy, who is a senior energy analyst with the Energy Policy and Security Division in the International Energy Agency. She leads in-depth reviews of member countries and manages government relations on behalf of the IEA. And she will be followed by Namrata Ginoya, who is a senior program manager on the resilience and energy with the World Resources Institute in India. She's a climate resilience and disaster risk reduction expert, and she works on research, policy advisory, knowledge management in agriculture, water sanitation, land use, forestry, health, and energy access sectors. So she works across very many diverse sectors related to infrastructure. And before I move on to the first question that I have for them, let me just remind you to put your questions in the chat box. And at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session where you can ask your questions from the panelists. So my first question is to Divya. So last year, the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions issued a groundbreaking report examining the social impacts of the shift to cleaner energy transitions. Can you outline the various ways that policies can be more inclusive of people in energy transitions? Over to you, Divya.
Okay, thank you, Zani, and good morning to everyone. So I thought I'd just take a little bit of a step back and provide some context for why people-centered clean energy transitions are necessary and why the IEA is spending more time on this. So as more and more countries set these ambitious goals to accelerate the shift to clean energy, people will undoubtedly experience significant changes in how they use energy, how they work, how they travel. So the success of clean energy transitions will depend on efforts to really enable citizens to benefit from these changes and to navigate any disruptions. It's clear that well-designed clean energy policy, transition policies can bring many benefits to people's lives, including greater access to affordable energy, cleaner air, healthier buildings, more secure and resilient energy systems, and of course, mitigate the impacts of climate change. They'll also develop new sectors of employment and create sustainable jobs for the future. At the same time, these transitions will cause some disruptions to traditional energy industries, displacing jobs and dislocating communities. So if designed poorly or hastily, they can also drive up energy prices, disrupt economic activity, erode energy security, and exacerbate inequalities across society. So it highlights the need for good policy design of transition plans themselves, with an emphasis on strong public communication, social dialogue, and community engagement. So it's really for this reason that at the beginning of last year, the IEA's executive director convened the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions. So if we could put up the first slide. The commission included over 20 energy and climate ministers from around the world, as well as representatives of youth, labor, and civil society. And the idea was to build a group of thought leaders that represented as broad a cross-section of the world as possible. So it was chaired by the Danish energy minister and co-chaired by the energy minister of Senegal. And the intent of the commission was to provide clear, actionable recommendations that enable governments to implement better policies for achieving clean energy goals in ways that actually enhance people's lives, create jobs, protect the vulnerable, and ensure global energy access, affordability, and security. It's also important to note that local contexts matter a great deal, and that the exact policy pathways for people-centered transitions will differ considerably from country to country. It's just as important to acknowledge that the scale of support measures required to undertake people-centered transitions are not equally affordable to all governments, and that every country will approach the transition from a different starting point with different means. So to this end, the Global Commission's recommendations, if we can switch to the next slide, draw on real-world experience and lessons learned from all parts of the world to offer some practical solutions. The 12 recommendations are underpinned by 150 case studies from over 50 countries. And I'd like to emphasize here that while jobs and just transitions get a lot of attention and are undoubtedly a critical aspect of people-centered transitions, there are a number of other issues that government should consider in policymaking to ensure that transitions are truly fair and inclusive. So the Global Commission built its recommendations around 4 themes. The first is decent jobs and worker protection. The second is social and economic development. The third is equity, social inclusion, and fairness. And the fourth is engaging people as active participants. So I'd like to briefly draw everyone's attention to 2 recommendations in particular that I think are relevant to today's topic. The first is to incorporate gender equality and social inclusion considerations into energy policies. And the second is to engage people as active participants. So equity and social inclusion should be built into clean energy policy design to prevent any risk of disproportionate or unintended consequences for certain segments of society, as well as to avoid exacerbating existing inequalities. In particular, in several countries, women are often disproportionately affected by lack of access to clean, reliable, and resilient energy. So a climate resilient system that provides reliable energy for cooking, water pumping, heating, or cooling during extreme weather events can significantly enhance gender equality. It can save significant time spent on collecting water and fuel during droughts and floods, and help women invest more time in their education and training. So a good example of this is in Indonesia, a program called Copernic Wonder Women, which trains women entrepreneurs and provides them with affordable clean technologies such as biomass stoves, solar lighting, and water filters to sell to their communities. Additionally, when a climate-driven disruption occurs, the significant socioeconomic costs of interrupted energy supply often disproportionately affect vulnerable groups. Indigenous communities located in remote areas are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on energy systems. Many of these communities rely on small-scale fossil fuel energy systems that are prone to frequent supply disruptions and outages from extreme weather events. So for example, in Canada, there are approximately 200 remote Indigenous communities that are completely dependent on diesel as a major source for heat and power. And while it's considered a reliable source of energy, the diesel reliance can also be debilitating for these communities. Transporting the fuel into the communities, either by barge, plane, or road, is expensive, and it makes remote communities more sensitive to fluctuations in global diesel prices. At the same time, we also see that a rapidly changing permafrost and more intense or frequent extreme weather events could affect diesel production and the safety of transportation. And in fact, we've already seen this with strong hurricanes such as Katrina and Delta, which have disrupted oil production in North America and drove up global oil prices, negatively impacting affordability and access for these dependent communities. So diversifying energy options and shifting to locally available energy sources can improve the climate resilience of remote indigenous communities. So to support the transition of these communities to clean energy sources, Canada launched 3 related programs: the Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities program, the Indigenous Off Diesel Initiative, and the Northern Responsible Energy Approach for Community Heat and Electricity program. And collectively, these programs are supporting renewable energy and capacity building projects in more than 160 communities across Canada that aim to create climate resilient energy infrastructure and energy self-sufficiency in these communities by accelerating the low carbon transition to community-driven solutions. So those are just
great. Yeah, those are great examples. Sorry to interrupt you. But can we come back to some of these points as well later on in the Q&A?
Sure.
Those are really, really great examples. So if I can just ask you to wrap up, I'm sorry to...
that was actually I was just going to wrap up right there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think you have presented really such a great overview of the need for us to really not just focus on sort of issues related to just transition, but overall the importance of ensuring that in the policy design, we look for how to integrate gender equality and social inclusion in order to ensure that there are no unintended negative consequences, not only for the planet, but also for people and communities. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I interrupted you, but just hopefully we'll have time at the end to come back to some of the points that you made. So I will turn now to Namrata. You have written how in India, poor and marginalized communities really face the dual challenges of low socioeconomic development and extreme vulnerability to climate change. So can you share with us some of the key considerations for developing decentralized energy systems with such communities based on your work that you have done in India and in Kenya? So over to you, Namrata.
Yeah, thanks, Zani. First of all, it's generally considered that decentralization of energy systems directly results in resilience because grid often breaks down during rapid disasters, and decentralization is considered to make the entire energy system more resilient. But we need to understand that these decentralized systems as well, they themselves are also vulnerable to climate disasters or any other kind of disasters. Also, in terms of communities, what we need to understand is we need to include them starting from design. Mostly they are included during the execution process, which is when a lot of their local labor is used, or they are probably used in some form of operations. But we need to include them in all stages of infrastructure development, starting from design to monitoring and evaluation as well. We also need to understand what their needs are. As we see, depending on climate, temperatures, rainfall patterns, the use of a particular infrastructure will keep changing. So as the world heats up, the requirement of energy will change. And if we start building infrastructure which is considering this kinds of current temperatures, it will not last for long, or it will not be enough for the future. We also need to understand the community's short-term needs. When we end up designing disaster resilient infrastructure, what we end up looking at is long-term benefits. As a designer, we want this to sustain. But there are also a lot of short-term requirements of the community. If you are putting up a decentralized energy system for, say, healthcare system, you have to have quick benefits that the community will be able to see. And that also helps them becoming more invested in the infrastructure as well. Also including them in the overall operations and maintenance, understanding their perspective of looking after the infrastructure health. Additionally, for energy, I would also say that it helps if we are able to help them connect energy with the other infrastructures that exist in that community. Energy, as yesterday's discussions were going on, was mentioned as one of the keystone infrastructure. And so access to energy itself leads to access to water, can help you access sanitation infrastructure, can help you improve your education facilities, your healthcare system. A lot of it is dependent on energy. And so if you are able to explain to the communities how energy access or this decentralized energy systems are going to help you in accessing other things, including livelihoods. A lot of irrigation projects now, what we see, solar-based irrigation projects. Throughout the value chain of a product, agriculture product, we see solar being invested for cold storages, for drying processes. So there's a lot of application where communities can be involved in designing the system as well as maintaining the system. And finally, I would say that we need to understand how the infrastructure will sustain with the help of community and the finance that should be associated with maintaining that system as well. So if the finance is going to be coming from whoever did the implementation or execution, that needs to be part of the design process, that needs to be explained in the planning process. If it's not going to be part of coming from the government or coming from whoever financed the infrastructure, then the system has to be set up so that when a disaster strikes, they are able to respond to it, they are able to recover that infrastructure from what has happened. And so the finance associated with that needs to be considered as well for the communities. Zani, back to you.
Great, thank you very much. I think this is a very good segue to our next two speakers who will really delve a bit more on the community participation aspect as well as the finance. So first we have Ms. Megan Volu. She's the she's the computer aided design manager for the RISE program in Suva, Fiji. And she has over 12 years of experience in engineering in the construction field and over 2 years of experience working with communities in informal settlements. And she will be followed by Mr. Arga Sinaroy, who has been working on disaster and climate resilience issues since 2003. And he is my colleague and the principal climate change adaptation specialist at the Asian Development Bank. So I will begin with a question for Megan. So RISE is really a transdisciplinary research program working at the intersections between health, environment, and water and sanitation, which is supporting 24 informal settlements across Makassar in Indonesia and in Suva, Fiji. So from Megan, we would like to hear how you are working with communities, governments, local leaders, and partner institutions in co-designing these local solutions that integrate green infrastructure to strengthen water and sanitation and health related outcomes. So can I hand it over to you, Megan?
Thank you so much, Zonibel, for the question. Nisambola Vinaka and namaste to my fellow colleagues here in the room, to my fellow panelists as well joining me, and all those who are joining in virtually. I'd also like to take this time to thank the CDRI for hosting such an important event highlighting the need for inclusive and community-driven approaches for disaster resilient infrastructure. I'm very humble and excited to have been invited to represent and speak on behalf of the RISE project and the work that we do for this cause, our communities, and the hardworking team back home. If we could please move to the first slide. So Zoni, perhaps the best way to answer your question is to first give you a brief description on the project and its initiatives. So RISE, or Revitalizing Informal Settlements and Their Environments, is an action research-based pilot project that works on a decentralized approach to wastewater treatment on site rather than relying on the existing sewer systems. These existing sewer systems are limited in its capability, in its capacity, and they have provisions. They have provisions for more formalized infrastructure, but when it comes to our informal settlements, there's not really that much priority given to them. The aim of the project is to reduce communities' exposure to contamination using nature-based solution infrastructure such as wetland systems, and we also are introducing new technologies into the Pacific, such as pressure tanks that have never been used before. Well, not in the Pacific anyway. We hope to prove that by improving the physical environment, this in turn will also improve the human health and ecological environment in these communities. We are anchored locally in government, who are our biggest landowners for the state. They helped select the sites at the conception of the project using three main criteria, which are these informal settlements would have had to have been formalized or established for many years with no prior or future plans for development. They would have had to have at least 30 children under the age of 5. I'll explain a bit more later as to why that was one of the criteria. And they would have had to have experienced water stresses. So thanks to government ministries such as the Ministry of Housing and Community Development and the Department of Lands back home, we were able to narrow down the 100+ sites to just the 12 sites that we focus on now. So we have 12 sites here back home in Suva, Fiji, and 12 sites at our sister project in Makassar in Indonesia. So if you look at the slide, we have the rice treatment train. So basically this is just the components of the system that we hope to introduce to our sites. As you can see from the slide, we've tried to include as many cultural demographics as we can. We've translated these slides into English and then also in Itaukei and Hindi, which is the three main cultural demographics back at home. And we've given descriptions on the parts of the infrastructure, which are the pressure tanks, piped from the households into septic tanks where it receives its first treatment, and then through our subsurface and surface wetlands. Thank you. Next slide, please. So RISE has two main teams within the project. Since it is an action research pilot project, this would be the build team, which is the action part of the intervention. So the build team, we engage with our communities in the form of workshops. These workshops are catered in the hopes to acknowledge the communities for showing up. We have representatives from each household that come for these workshops. We educate these community members on the RISE treatment train, the importance, the need for the project in terms of the health benefits, climate change impacts, and the importance of having communities to take charge of the operation and maintenance to ensure its sustainability, therefore ensuring the infrastructure's resilience to both man-made damages and damages incurred by climate change or climate impacts. So we designed the infrastructure together with them, where they're fully involved to encourage transparency and accountability. Thank you. Next slide, please. So because we know by the three main criteria that these communities already face water stresses, we work with our communities to identify where these water stresses are, where these inundated water flooding happens. So working with the communities, they identify locations. We install flood gauges in these locations, and during tidal flooding or heavy rains, we encourage our community members to take a photo of the tide levels and then send them back to us to a focal point back in the office. We provide recharge cards when necessary so that they're able to send us this data with no expense incurred on them. And this influences the design of the infrastructure to ensure that when we decided we're building it to the proper, above the proper flood levels and the tidal levels that these communities face, so that our wetlands don't get inundated with this flood water. Thank you. Next slide,
Megan?
please.
Megan, if I can just ask you to wrap up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. There's a lot of aspects of the project, and I wish I could touch more on, but in the interest of time, I wish to just condense this a little. So we work with government, we work with our communities in the form of design, and also we work with the private sector, engaging engineers, local engineers, to approve the drawings, and then these drawings are taken back to the communities for their consent and approval. So this is just a few of the different aspects of the team, and of course we also have an assessment team, which is the research aspect of the project. And with any pilot project, we need to prove that the intervention works. So our assessment team, they do soil sampling, fecal sampling with the children below the age of 5, which was mentioned earlier. And if there's any sicknesses found in their fecal samples, for example, RISE has a duty of care, and we ensure that these children are taken and given the best medical care, medicines, so that they aren't prone to sickness all the time. Yes, thank you, Zonibel. That's just how we partner with different stakeholders for this project. Naka.
Ulavinaka, thank you. So I think, it is, as you said, there's so many different aspects to the RISE program, to the work that WRI is doing, as well as the presentation that Divya has made about the work of the Commission. And I wonder whether, since we're not going to have a lot of time to really spend talking about some of the other issues that have come out in the presentation, could I just encourage the speakers to put in the chat the resources that you might be referring to, perhaps some studies or the report, the link to the report of the Commission and so on, so that people can go and read more about the work that your different organizations are doing. So with that, I will move on to Argo, who has been working on the Community Resilience and Partnership Program, which aims to strengthen climate resilience in Asia and the Pacific by increasing climate adaptation investments that explicitly address the climate, gender, and poverty nexus, especially at the community and local level. This is really has been the brainchild of Argo. And this program uses an innovative financing approach to support women, particularly women working at the grassroots level and the poor and vulnerable communities. So Argo, can you talk about the program, particularly why ADB identified the need for such an approach?
Thanks, Zoni, and a very good afternoon, everybody from Manila. First of all, thanks to CRI colleagues for organizing this session, and also for my ADB colleagues for helping put together the session. I think there's a background slide, if I could request our organizers to put on, please. So Zoni, as you mentioned, the Community Resilience Partnership Program is actually a 10-year program established last year at COP26 with the idea to scale up investments at the local level on adaptation and resilience, specifically investments that address the nexus between poverty, gender, and climate, and which takes investments to scale. Currently, it's a facility of about $70 million and supported by a range of partners, including UK, the Nordic Development Fund, French Development Agency, and research organizations like IIED and Grassroots Women's Network like Waru Commission. So going back to your question, why we thought this program is important, there are 3 specific reasons. First of all, of course, we know that the poorest population are disproportionately impacted by climate and disaster risk. And we have seen estimates by World Bank, which talks about how additional 100 million people will dip into poverty by 2030 because of climate impacts. The recent pandemic estimates by ADB shows additional 78 million people being pushed into extreme poverty. And we know that women and men are impacted differently, and a majority of women, poor population in the region are women. So this clearly makes a case that we need to have dedicated or targeted interventions that really builds resilience of the poorest population through various mechanisms, including through infrastructure. The second reason is that estimates also show that while we understand the need of building resilience of the poorest population at the local level, the money is not necessarily flowing to the local level. I mean, estimates by IIED shows that less than $1 in every $10 as investments from global climate funds actually goes to local level to build resilience. And within that $1, minuscule actually goes towards, let's say, women-focused interventions or interventions led by women's group. So another important aspect is how can we fix this architecture through which money flows to the local level. And the third point, I think, which is very, very critical, but also perhaps the most difficult one to address, is that when we say we are building resilience, we do not automatically challenge inequality. Our resilience interventions do not automatically challenge inequality unless we have an explicit focus on it. And this is for various reasons, including the various appraisal mechanisms tend to focus more on the economics or the financial implications or benefits of investing in resilience. And sometimes the poor and marginalized populations do not fit into that. So for us, these three reasons of disproportionate impacts, money flowing to the local level, and need to challenge inequality are the main three reasons for this program. And I'm very happy that the program is closely aligned with the recent findings of the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report, which clearly talks about that if we really want, at the end of the day, efficient and effective adaptation solutions, such solutions need to be integrated solutions, multi-sectoral solutions, and closely implemented along with addressing social inequalities. And that's the bottom line for us in developing the program. Over to you, Zoni.
Thank you very much. Just trying to find the unmute button. I know that we are running short of time, and we sort of, this session has really started off with sort of a bit of a reality check and sort of showing us what this work actually means at the community level. And we heard from Rimjin about that, as well as, Divya has taken us through the policy imperative and how we need to design and think about sort of developing policy that is inclusive. And then we've heard sort of the practical experiences, and now from the practical experiences from Megan and from Namrata of working with communities. And now, I think you've talked about the finance piece, but you've also talked about sort of the issue, which I find really interesting, the issue of actually also challenging the structural inequalities that exist. So not only working to sort of meet with the sort of the demands and the needs of people at the community level, but also working with them to change that situation and to reduce those existing inequalities and work at the structural level as well. So I think that's a very interesting point. I wonder whether we have any questions from the audience. Since we have very little time, I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a couple of questions if there are any. And if not, maybe I can move on to a couple of questions that I have for the speakers. So I don't think that there are any questions from the audience from what I can see, but with this virtual thing. I'm not quite sure whether I'm actually seeing the question. So I will move on, and I will just start with asking a question to Megan and Namrata. And also, Rimjin, if you would like to also respond to this question, but I'll just give you 1 minute to respond to this question. So you talked about some of the challenges, but and maybe some of the lessons learned. But I wonder whether you could speak to a little bit more about sort of what are some of your key lessons and the benefits that you saw from engaging with communities in the resilient operations and management of the infrastructure. I know that this is something that the RISE project is sort of also experienced in terms of handing over the operations and management of the infrastructure, as well as, WRI's experience. Maybe Rimjin, you have something to add to that as well. So the question is, can you talk a bit about the maybe lessons learned, challenges, and benefits of engaging communities in the resilient operations and management of the infrastructure?
Thank you, Zoni, for the question. I think one of the biggest challenges we face with our informal settlements is that they're informal settlements. There are people that come from all over Suva and Fiji to settle in a particular part of Suva. There's not much social structure, so therefore there's not really that much trust within the communities itself. So when we come in as a project, it takes a while for them to understand that we're here for their benefit, getting them to trust the project and our initiatives. But one of the main benefits from working with these communities is because it gives them a sense of pride to take over the infrastructure. These communities have sort of not been prioritized. They have a lack of resources when it comes to government funding, access to clean water and health and sanitation. So it's giving them back a voice, encouraging them to take ownership of this intervention, because if they wish for other stakeholders to take them seriously, we have to encourage them to start taking themselves seriously in their communities in uplifting the health and sanitation within the settlements. Thank you, Zoni.
So on one side, I would say that it's difficult to nudge them towards activities that depend on a particular infrastructure, and then for a long-term sustainability of that infrastructure. Just an example, irrigation right now, it's mostly dependent on energy as well as water-based infrastructure. But we want them to be able to access irrigation, but they also need to probably lay off high water intensive crops in certain regions for this particular system to continue working, for them to be able to continue to access the services that are being provided by these two infra. So that it's a bit difficult to nudge them into different kinds of activities. And also, as you mentioned, trust. A lot of contractors or vendors would come and go, and some of them actually go out of business, and so there isn't a long-term maintenance plan in place in many cases. And so communities really don't trust that kind of coming and going, and that sort of becomes very difficult. And the third point I would say is, if a particular infrastructure has not been seen in that region, just giving an example, we recently visited certain villages where energy access is not prevalent. And so once they did get access, they weren't sure exactly what to do with that. They've not been able to use it apart from, just for basic lighting. They cannot convert that into, productive use applications. And on the other hand, if they've seen it somewhere else, then they want the exact replication to be done in their community, which may not be possible or may not be appropriate for that kind of region. So these are some of the challenges sort of working with.
Great, thank you. And Ranjan, do you want to add anything to this?
So I would like to add that community, we need to give them time. It will take a lot of time to bring community together and actually teach them or let them know and make them aware that why it is important that they also play a role in designing and developing an infrastructure and later on maintaining it. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of initial hand holding and a lot of capacity building. But once they reach to that level that there is a lot of social cohesion in the village and they are together and work together for the development of their whole village, they are able to be very transparent and share mechanisms which are more equitable and take the viewpoint of poorest of the poor household. So if a community is not knit together and they are not talking or taking decisions together on one single platform about the kind of infrastructure they want to develop or kind of activities that they want to engage with for their village, maybe some people who are not more aware or maybe some people who are more vulnerable will be left out of the conversation. So people who are more aware and are more dominant, or maybe they have stronger connections with the political leaders, they might be taking all the benefits. But if the community is knit together and is taking decisions for the benefit of whole village, they are more transparent and they are able to provide access to that particular vulnerable group which was left out earlier. Secondly, there is a lot of social change in the whole village when they are coming together. There are multiple user groups. For example, there is a user group for taking advantage of a irrigation system. There might be a user group for taking advantage of a check dam or the groundwater conservation structure that has been built. But when village comes together, there are multiple user groups sitting on same platform and talking about what is the main justifiable part of this, and they can make rules and regulations for penalizing people who are actually damaging the structures or not taking care of those structures or are responsible for creating these kind of difficult situations for others. There have been examples when there were, like Namrata said, there were many contractors who were using bad quality material. So this community, they stood over there and said, no, this is not the right work that you are doing. We'll complain about you. They went to the local governing body. They complained to the panchayat leader, and he said, no, this is the way how things are done. Then they went to the senior government administration and got that work carried out in a more better way and with full quality.
Thank you so much. I think those are really important points that you bring out around, building trust, time, the issue of nudging the community, behavior change, as well as sort of the need for social cohesion, which we heard very clearly from both of you, Ranjan, as well as Megan. So I know we're almost out of time, but I would like to just have one last question for Argo and for Divya, and then we will very quickly wrap up and hand over to our next set of speakers. So the question for Divya and Argo is really very much around the question of finance, which we know that is critical for people-centered energy transitions and adaptation and resilience to climate change. So can you share, and I know, Divya, you had some really great examples earlier on. So can you share some good examples of innovative financing approaches that should be expanded in 1 minute or less each? Sorry about that.
Okay, I'll be very brief here. I'll just say that one model that seems to have had some success is the building of renewable energy communities. So it's where you kind of pool local resources, basically you can kind of you produce the energy from things like rooftop solar, and then you can sell the surplus energy to the grid and share it with neighboring buildings, and you get that kind of aggregation of infrastructure that allow kind of smaller private investors, individuals or households, to cross those investment thresholds that are necessary and achieve economies of scale, as well as empower communities to benefit from some of the funding available from governments and financial incentives available to governments.
Should I come in, Zoni? So from my perspective, there are many examples of various kind of innovative financing instruments, including some governments like the Philippines or Tonga, which have set up national funds for adaptation resilience. We have governments like India, which has national programs like the Manrega program, which delivers resilience at the local level. And then we have large-scale projects or initiatives by civil society organizations based on years of development work, specifically around savings group, etc. But what is important is to understand is that we're not talking only about the quantity of finance. We're talking about the quality of finance. That's first. Second is there has to be a mix between top-down financial architecture and bottom-up financial architecture and how they can complement each other. And third, based on what Rimjim said earlier, I think it's very important. It's not about what we are financing, but also how we are financing it. So at the end of the day, we don't want only resilient infrastructure to be financed, but also financing for a process that brings the communities together and helps to organize the communities so they are empowered at the end of the day to make decision of the right infrastructures. For me, these three aspects are very critical if you want to scale up financing modalities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm very sorry that we had such limited time, because I think we can certainly have a longer conversation about these issues, given the incredible wealth of experience that is among you. But I hope that we will have in the future other opportunities for us to continue this conversation. And please, if you can share relevant resources in the chat box or with the organizers so that they can share with the participants, so that we can learn more about the RISE program, the work of the Global Commission and WI's work and so on. So I think that would be really important and critical information for all of us to have as we work towards more people and gender inclusive resilient infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dalberg, the Dalberg design team. So they will now have a session on how we can shift so it's a practical session on applying tools for human and equity centered design for resilient infrastructure. So this part of the session will be facilitated by the Dalberg design team. So I'll hand it over to them, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So wonderful to hear all of these very inspiring stories from our previous speakers and panelists. I wish we could have more time to hear from all of you, but I know we're all operating with the same constraints. But thank you all for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Ravi Chatpar, co-founder and partner at Dalberg Design, and I'm joined here by my colleague Prerak.
I'm Prerak, and I'm a director of design at Dalberg, based in Mumbai. I'll be back to you.
Great. So you should all see our screen here. I'd like to start the conversation with a poll. So if you could launch the poll for the audience. When you think about how to innovate in the context of resilient infrastructure, where do you typically start? Do you think about the physical infrastructure of your region, how to map it and assess it? Do you scenario plan around hypothetical future state crises and disasters? Do you study the profiles and needs of communities and their systems? Do you think about risks and what the right set of risks are and how to mitigate for those risks? Do you think about technology, the infrastructure, its strengths, gaps, and opportunities there? Or do you approach it from more of a budget perspective about how to budget for infrastructure investment in a flexible enough way to support the different types of needs that may emerge as disasters may unfold? So if we could just take 30 seconds to reflect on these prompts for where you start when you think about infrastructure innovation. And when the poll results are ready, please just project them on screen. Can we see what responses have come in? Asking those who control the technology. So far, initial results I'm seeing in the chat is D. D seems to be the winner of developing a comprehensive risk register and mitigation plans. I don't know how the other C is the third, mapping profiles and needs of communities, is at has 1/3 of the responses. So I'm glad to see that 3 is in there. That is indeed kind of what we wanted to speak about, but fully appreciate the importance of thinking about the risk and mitigation plans as well. All of these are in fact correct in a certain sense. They're all important when we think about developing an overall infrastructural plan. But what we wanted to share is an approach to think about innovation that really anchors on communities. It starts with the people, it starts with us, it starts with communities, and uses the inspiration that emerges from that understanding to inform how we think about physical infrastructure, how we think about scenario planning, how we think about risk mitigation, how you think about technology strategy and budget planning. And so in some ways, we see that starting point as a powerful way to develop resilient infrastructures over time. Moving to the next slide, please. I think the core, fundamentally what we believe at Dahlberg Design is we are a consultancy, a design consultancy with 5 design studios globally. And fundamentally, we believe that creative potential is being wasted globally. And that is the most precious human resource that we are trying to preserve and grow. The approach that we use is what we call ECCD. Moving to the next slide, equity-centered and community-based design. I think there may feel like there's a lot of jargon on this slide, but essentially what this tries to bring together is, I think some of the principles we've just heard about from our fellow panelists and speakers, an element of human-centered design, which is really an approach to problem solving that puts humans and communities at the center of the innovation process. Community development, which is very much about partnering directly with communities and other types of organizations, such as grassroots and community-based organizations, to build capacity and exchange knowledge and transfer power and agency around decision-making. And then an element of systemic change, which is really thinking about the system from an equity perspective. What are the biases and injustices that exist, and how do you facilitate the transfer of power and agency to communities to be able to design the solutions to the challenges that they see around them. So with this framing, what I'm going to do is hand it over to Prerak to talk us through a bit of a case study from some of the work that we've done, and ask the audience, all of you, to participate as we go along. to understand how an approach like this in the context of one of the most important crises we've all faced in the last few years, the COVID crisis, created challenges and opportunities for how we think about resilient infrastructure more broadly.
Thanks a lot, Ravi, and I hope you all are able to hear me well. There's a case study about engagement that we started calling Vaccine Action Lab. And as the different waves started hitting India and vaccine availability started easing out, it wasn't that there was a sudden increase in vaccine uptake, right? There were big swaths of population who were still unable to get it. And where we landed was like almost an infrastructural engine needed to be put in place from our end. And as a first step, it started with work in Bihar, which at that stage last year was one of the most lagging in terms of absolute number and even relative number of vaccinations compared to where the country was heading. And it's a state of 120 million plus people, so no small amount there. So there were 4 core parts we recognized. Obviously, we have to work with the government, build credibility, get a seat at the table in the war room, work with partners which are on ground, which deal with a lot of structural and physical infrastructure, right? Healthcare centers, the people, the facilities, the camps, and so on. The technology infrastructure partners like the WhatsApps and the social data analysis people and all the other different layers. And people who deal a lot with the community and humans themselves, the multilateral folks, the UNICEF, the WHO, CHAI, CARE, and everyone else. So that's where the genesis of this work kind of almost started. If I go here a bit, right, this kind of talks a little bit about how we entered post-Delta, which had seen one of the worst human infrastructure damages this country had seen. It also saw a lot of erosion of physical healthcare infrastructure failing, at least for the first time since I have known our primary healthcare infrastructure, which is extremely robust. We worked post that, worked through the Omicron crisis, trying to see how can this be adopted for it being very responsive, and eventually had to pivot to other areas, which we'll cover shortly, into digital health and so on and so forth, to continue building the resilience from the learnings that we had from this entire engagement. The cornerstone of our approach was the human infrastructure element, which some of the other panels have kind of touched upon. What this basically meant, as you look at this complicated slide of us trying to visually represent an engine, was there were 3 aspects of the human touchpoints. One, the community themselves. Obviously, we needed to understand what are the different needs, what are the different behaviors, why certain sets are taking versus not. The healthcare workers and the frontline workers in terms of ASHAs, ANMs, the self-help groups. How can we strengthen that layer of the human infrastructure? And the third being the government folks themselves, right? Everyone was extremely stretched. There were bureaucrats and like frontline folks and like top level decision makers. They were 24/7 working to do this. How could we supplement them with like the best data to have very informed decision making, which is synthesized across all these different points? This is a small snapshot of the kind of demarcation we were able to come up with different community members. We like to call them personas or like in-depth user profiles, which are not just based on demographics, which we obviously needed. We had demographics up to a district level or hyper-local targeting. But more importantly, what are their fears? How do they look at vaccination? Is it more about time poverty, or is it more about non-availability? Is it more about they think COVID is no longer a problem? Or is it something very real as I just don't have the right documentation or the camp is far away? And could we run great data analysis and a lot of human-centered design interviews using our large network of 20 plus community folks across different districts in Bihar to be able to have this granular understanding of people, which are overcautious, perceived restricted, indifferent, constrained, and misbelievers. But I want to take a quick pause here to see, Ravi, if you wanted to help us understand how we usually apply these things as well in many themes outside of just this case study.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think that it's important to reflect on here is that, you know, when we think about infrastructural innovation, we're often thinking about solutions or approaches that are covering quite a broad scale, you know, entire cities or regions or countries. And so our starting point often tends to be, we need to think about, you know, so to speak, mass market oriented approaches, right? Approaches that are going to serve the entire population. But from a design perspective, I think starting from the perspective of individual personas, right, which gives us a perspective about needs, behaviors, influences, hopes, and fears, actually tends to inspire different thinking. And then it becomes more of a conceptualization challenge. How do you bring what emerges from thinking about different specific subsegments of communities together into a broader infrastructural solution? So maybe this is a good place to let's bring in a poll as well. If you could launch the second poll.
It would be great to hear from the audience, like if you had to start from any of these one personas, who would you select? Would you select the largest segment? Would you select the most vulnerable group? Would you select the need which is most unmet? How would you go about it? And while the polls are being launched and people are like jotting their responses, the 5 personas we are showing were a subset of 23 different personas that we had to come up with, given that there were challenges across different levels. People who had no vaccines, people who had 1 vaccine, hadn't taken second. As the work progressed, people who had taken 2 vaccines were not taking booster shots, and so on and so forth. So these challenges in terms of decision-making points of who do we prioritize were not a one-time thing, and would be great to see where the audience sees making that choice as well. The poll has been launched, just been informed.
Would I be able to ask a question at this point in time? Could you explain what the rationale is for having to choose only one group to prioritize in this effort? Sorry, my name is John Carstensen. I'm from Mott MacDonald, a global advisory and infrastructure business.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I can take that. So I think for the one thing, just to clarify, I think for the purpose of the conversation today, we're asking you to just pick one so we could talk through how we think about their needs and behaviors and challenges specifically. In practice, we wouldn't be picking one of these. We would be thinking about all 5 of them, but trying to be very specific, almost treating them as 5 different segments we're trying to design for, right? So overcautious versus indifferent. They, may have, they're both large subsegments of the community, but they have different types of needs, different types of behaviors, different types of challenges, different motivations for engaging with vaccines and other elements of the health infrastructure or the health system. And based on that more detailed understanding, can we come up with ideas or solutions that speak to them specifically, right? So then the question becomes, how do you serve the market overall, right? And the full population. And so looking for those commonalities between approaches that serve multiple segments, or trying to think about how different ideas could be combined or sequenced in a way that allows you to reach everyone, we find is a better way to ensure that everyone truly engages, as opposed to taking more of a one-size-fits-all solution and trying to hope that you can push it to some very, very different segments or subsegments.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ravi, and thanks for that question. That was something that leads us to actually our next slide, and the poll results are in. And it is not surprising that A, 1, 3, and 4 have 20%, and 5 has 40%. And I'm very surprised 2 has 0% as of now. But to say that there is no one clear winner, right? Because when it comes to people and segments, percentage and numbers is one part, but we don't want to leave anyone really behind. And that's where I want to focus us as a group, to focus a bit on, like, what are these needs really talking about? Are these needs really unique to that group? There are some. There are other needs which are more common across them. If you look at overcautious, which is the largest of this pool, has fear it may be harmful, but so does the misbelievers, which is the smallest of this group. There are certain things like pregnancy and breastfeeding in the perceived restricted are very much more peculiar thing about that group. And to us, this became one of the big priorities, because it's a very vulnerable group. And if you look at even a ratio of population of pregnant and lactating women at any point in Bihar, that's just tremendously high. And we are talking about a few 100,000 people, not in tens of thousands, which was just getting unaddressed. At this slide, while I'm going to take a jump and a leap, is to say that based on a lot of these needs clubbed together for different personas, some solution ideas that we came up with were peculiar to a certain persona, some cut across other personas. And mostly human infrastructure or physical infrastructure or tech infrastructure, one of these lenses became our starting point, and then we started adding more and more layers and came up with like 30 odd solutions with a lot of different partners. So on the left side, we have something which is a campaign for mother-in-laws and for the frontline healthcare workers to ensure that the pregnant lactating women have the right set of information. They have the right support structure to go to the vaccine center and get the vaccine out there, because there's a lot of misinformation. Initially, it was announced it's unsafe. Then it was announced it's safe in certain times. And eventually, when scientific world said that now it is safe, it's not like people will forget the last announcement, and there was mass confusion. And the second one, which cuts across many segments, tries to address the fears of side effects, fears that COVID is no longer important, by creating a dialogue through digital and physical places, led by the different influencers in the community. I'll pause here to say, Ravi, if you want to chime in a bit about how we usually use rapid prototyping and other techniques to test these out in our work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of this method is that it allows us to explore many different types of ideas quickly, right? So I think this is in some ways a core design practice of let's explore ideas in lower fidelity, right? So rather than investing the effort into designing, to piloting a full program or creating prototypes of new products or services, can we instead explore in a lighter weight form a broad range of ideas? And I think conventionally we talk about this as, I think that the term is often associated with the ideas of products or services, but in fact, more conceptually, prototyping, it can be applied to many things, right? You can think about prototyping policies, about partnerships, about business models, about blended finance instruments, of course, government programs, and actual products and services. And so the idea of visually representing, rapidly evaluating, and iterating and improving to eventually converge on a set of options that are you have more confidence in before putting in more before putting more investment into it is core to the approach. And as you're seeing here, that it can touch human, physical, technology dimensions, amongst others.
Thanks a lot, Ravi. And now I'll take a couple of minutes to take us through like how the process evolved and what does a solution which turned into an intervention at all the three layers of infrastructure, physical, human, and digital look like. So we did prototyping, we did prioritization sessions, we worked with partners and government to say, here are total 9 interventions. And here are specific districts within the state where you should go and targetedly work on that. And there was obviously a priority. And the one priority one is in front of you. It was called Mother Safe, Child Safe, because what we realized is at a very core human level, while people care about themselves and they care about their community and they care about the wider world, the most they care about is their child. And that is the messaging that needs to land well, that yes, it's for your safety, but it's more importantly for your children's safety in the household for pregnant lactating women. And so hence we had a multi-pronged approach. On the left, you see there's a lot of pregnant lactating women focused clarification, FAQ videos. Some were more behavioral messaging style pitches, and they were boosted across the state through targeted social media. There was a lot of physical content to train our frontline healthcare workers, which was custom made for them. What should they talk to? Who should they first approach in the house in their day-to-day visit? What happens when someone comes to a healthcare center for vaccination or a camp? Can you leave behind some material with them? And on the right side is a quick snapshot of a pilot that we did across around 30,000 people in 2 weeks to generate the right evidence for government to feel confident that there is value in this and it could be rolled out at a mass scale. Very quickly on this one, where we want to land is that the point that Ravi made initially, equity-centered and community-centered approach, right? You would have heard me speak throughout that a lot of our things were implemented by community leads. They were implemented by frontline workers who enjoyed a certain degree of base trust. Anyone coming from outside that block level would be seen as a foreigner, whether I live in Patna and going there, or I live in Mumbai, or you can keep increasing the distance and say outside India, right? So I think that trust really helped us in this ECCP approach. The government, our partners, really believe that anything that is more community-led would definitely have more chances of success. So there was an understanding of equity from that end as well. And we continued this work, and many initiatives across Omicron, across the adolescent vaccination, booster doses, and beyond, were into physical infrastructure, where there were mass media campaigns, TV ads, physical receipts, which are reminders and all, wall paintings to keep the relevance high were done. There were a lot of technological interventions through the WhatsApp bot, helped increase its uptake and made it more relevant, and through informal WhatsApp groups and others. And the continuation of the human infrastructure, right? There were rapid response teams by the government to help overcome hesitancy and stuff. And we are still continuing to work with frontline healthcare workers to see how we can keep strengthening that layer of the infrastructure. But maybe I'll pause here to say, Ravi, if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I was maybe just one reflection here is I think that when we're thinking across these multiple dimensions, one of the biggest challenges is how you think about bringing these very different ideas together in the right order and sequence, recognizing they all have different levels of investment and different timelines to bring them to market. And in some ways, like if you think about the kind of classic MVP concept, right, a minimal viable product, what do you bring to market first that has the greatest chance of appealing to the target segment that is most likely going to build, momentum around, around a new product or service. Like that, those same principles apply when we think about more of a systems level solution, like we do in the infrastructure space. We can still think about sequencing technology, human and physical components in a way that creates that same combined sense of awareness and engagement through to each of those target personas that we're or subgroups within those target personas that we believe are most likely to engage and adopt, and use that as a way to develop kind of a master kind of blueprint for how to organize and kind of orchestrate and sequence these different types of complementary initiatives.
So maybe, I know this may not be a poll I have been informed, but it will pop up as a Q&A question under the Q&A section in the app. So highly encourage the audience to say which idea they think should be pursued. To the point Ravi was saying, there's cost and time implication. A simple wall painting done across every health center would cost a couple of $1 million, right, to pull it off, even if it's just $10 per wall painting when you start adding up the cost in that way. So what should one choose? And if you have more ideas, please feel free to write down your own. So maybe I've also heard from a few folks that potentially online there are a bit of challenges on responding and interacting with the Q&A section. So also happy to see from the studio there are any thoughts that people have.
Hello, I'm Vasi. I think when you talk about in terms of Bihar, what resilient infrastructure, I think while the focus is always on physical infrastructure, but I think during the presentation also it's been talked about that how we actually get into the social dynamic side of it to see how it works within each area, and then we focus on the challenges that are there so that we are able to overcome it. When examples are giving that, okay, like how even if it was in the block or panchayats using the human resources right there, the way, because it was like an ongoing and hand-holding in capacities that were being developed. So I think that's a useful mechanism to go by. That's all from my side. Thank you.
That's a really good comment. Thanks. That's something that we tried to enable through some of these solutions, and that's going through a deep network of community members who are spread out across the geography helped us a bit because they had good relationships with the ASHA there, the A&M there, the frontline workers, and also with basically the Gram Panchayats out there in that way. But that's a great observation. Are there any other reactions or questions from the audience? Maybe we could take a few as we have a little time left.
Good afternoon, Shockey Blanton, USAID. Or how have you progressed with the elegant solution for having continuous learning built into the model? This is to actually look at the tail once the prototype has actually gone into production, and see how, see what the correlations are inherent to the model. Wondering if you've thought that far yet, and how have you progressed? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I can take a little part of it. Ravi, would love to hear from you in general how we do it as well. For this particular, let's just take the example of that one solution with pregnant and lactating women. So the pilot had to be done in 2 weeks with across 30,000 folks, and everything mobilized, and we needed to show whether it's working or not working, right? So through a classic MEL approach, we could not do that. There's no end-line baseline. There's really no time for it, because the pace at which decisions were being taken was almost like tomorrow we need to do a mass vaccination campaign. Do we do it? We have like 2 days before that to provide inputs, just given COVID was evolving super fast. So we had to unlearn a lot of the classic way we gather feedback and channel it in. And again, we went back to a network of community leads and frontline workers and developed short surveys that they could administer, and some qualitative sessions that we could conclude. And something that could be churned out as whether it's working or not in 2 days towards the end of that pilot. And that is what would then help, along with a little bit more of social media listening we were doing, and digital scans, which could allow you to have a little bit projection 2 weeks in advance of the type of queries people are looking for and in which districts. So that data came on when to target from that, and whether this should be done with what modifications came from these quick surveys and some qualitative leads. But Ravi, over to you for in general.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of building on that point, and thank you for that question, because in some ways it gets at the very kind of core of how you make a process like this sustainable over time. Like rather than relying on a traditional kind of team that is responsible for understanding what that impact is over time, or understanding how to make improvements over time, can you convert that community network into essentially a team that is activated at all times, so to speak, right? So where they can be using approaches to understand the challenges and inspire solutions, develop prototypes, while in parallel also listening for reactions, gathering feedback. And so the process, in some ways, the generative process and the evaluative process start merging in practice through a network of community partners that is always on. And then you kind of layer that with, of course, more of a technology or a data analytics process, which, by definition is, can be always on, right? And that allows you to kind of operate in these very compressed cycles, which are, of course, particularly important when an actual, Omicron spike or disaster is happening, in real time.
Excellent presentation and great work in Bihar. I'm Sarabjit. I'm from UNICEF. Would you like to share some challenges on adaptive programming? Because I saw that you've been adapting your program quite often, depending upon the spikes and the stresses and so on and so forth. So would you like to share some of the challenges of program management? Because ultimately your human resources, your finances and budgets, they would go in different directions if you keep responding to the emerging needs, vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. So look forward to hearing from you.
I can start that a little bit, because thanks for that question. That was at the heart of a conflict internally for us as a Dalgo team. We are design consultants, right? Service providers. We like to plan and have the ideal solution in place using the best data possible. And the situation we found ourselves in was where any amount of data is better than no data. And it wasn't because no one wanted to use it, but just speed was unprecedented, never seen by the healthcare infrastructure to combat anything of this nature. So there were two directions we took. One is saying, there will be some things we'll need to respond to as and when it emerges. And we can't really plan in a programmatic way. So could we have a wide network and good relationships and partnerships with people who are already on the ground, like PCI, like CARE, like the UNICEF teams? Many of these have presence at a block level and who can activate, deactivate these networks in a very short time for fast moving things. But for long-term building, where frontline healthcare workers, I keep coming back to them, and other frontline workers like self-help groups, the gaps were evident that there were many things. It's not like COVID caused them, but COVID magnified the issues in capacity building and equipping them with the right technology and other means. So we decided in a classic programmatic journey to focus there in the long term, because that would be useful post-COVID as well in that way. Ravi, anything else you'd like to add there?
Nothing at the moment. I think you covered it. Thanks.
Folks, if we have time for one more question, then happy to take it. And also happy to conclude. I know we are close to the 30-35 minutes time you had passed. All right, assuming there are no questions, I can start. I would request Ravi to close the entire track post that. So looking back, right, a lot of this is retrospective. For us, building resilient infrastructure was at the core of our approach. When we started this journey, we were not saying we are building infrastructure in the sense we are talking now, right? We knew there were structural issues, there were behavioral issues, there were issues with technology. But it kind of falls in these same labels we are talking. And this infrastructural engine that we set out has now morphed into working on telehealth through strengthening frontline healthcare workers. And we are kind of using the learnings that we had during peak waves of COVID when vaccination numbers were not great and channeling them into adjacent health areas. And maybe in the coming months, we hope that this transforms into something else like early detection, which is a massive issue with, say, cardiac and health and diabetes and all the NCDs, and other areas where we can more continually help strengthen the healthcare infrastructure from all the three lenses. And with that, Ravi, over to you to close the session.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for staying a little bit longer. Just some final words. I hope that our presentation, in addition to what we heard from prior speakers and panelists, has all helped make the case for the importance of human-centered and community-centered approaches when we think about what it takes to build resilient infrastructures over time. I think all of us at Dahlberg Design, and speaking on behalf of the other panelists, would be very happy to continue the conversation with all of you. So feel free to reach out through the various channels that connect us if you'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you so much to all of you in the audience for your participation. Thanks to the panelists and speakers. Thank you to CDRI for hosting us today. And looking forward to connecting again. That concludes our session today. Thank you. Take care.